clenched his teeth into the clay, screamed like an animal, and called for his mother, who had been dead for a long time. A splinter had been torn from the floor of his chambers, scratched with fingernails and stained with black mucus. 5 court physicians stood at a distance, not daring to approach. One of them would later write, "He forgot that he was king. He remembered only the taste of blood and the shadow behind him." Charles, nicknamed the Beloved, had long since lost his power. His body, swollen, covered with rashes and cracks, stank of pus and vinegar. His brain had turned into a buzzing vessel of fear, whispers, and the clanging of invisible chains. For the 16th year in a row, he had been sinking into madness, surfacing only for a moment, only to be dragged back into the quagmire. It all began, as everyone thought, after the battle in the forest of Le Mans, where he had cut down his own guards in a fit of madness. At that time, they still hoped it was delirium, heat stroke, sunstroke. Now they had no hope. Now they kept him chained. His resting place was in the South Tower of Saint Paul, a castle in the heart of Paris. There, behind the deaf doors covered with pigskins, it smelled of damp, acid, and something else, something difficult to describe, but pungent. It was the smell of fear and rotting flesh. The windows were blocked with stones. No fire was allowed. He screamed at the sight of light. The entrance was guarded by guards who were replaced every 4 hours, not according to regulations, but according to complaints. No one could stand it any longer. One of the servants scratched on the wall, "Don't look into his eyes." Another threw himself from the balcony. Of the 37 silent nurses assigned to him, only 2 remained. The apothecary's records note, wine with opium powder in the morning, vinegar vapors in the evening, ammonia under his nose, 4 bloodlettings a week. Ointments with opium and dog fat were rubbed into his temples, armpits, and groin. It was useless. He still heard voices. He spoke to his dead brothers, cursed his son, and chewed the skin off his fingers. In his last weeks, he stopped saying names. He sat on his knees, leaning toward the floor, whispering as if confessing to the earth. When the chains were removed, he scratched the stone joints with his teeth and licked the dirt until his tongue began to bleed. The court physician, Jean Dubois, wrote in his report, "The mucus from his ears smells bad. His eyes are cloudy. His body is swollen. His anus does not hold feces. I believe he is poisoned with black bile caused by the liquefaction of the cerebral mucus. No incantation has any effect. No prayer penetrates his spirit." Charles's body was covered with ulcers, especially in the groin and under the chest, which emitted a nauseating odor. There was a worm-like movement under the skin. One of the assistants claimed to have seen a worm the length of a little finger crawl out of his ear. The armor of power surrounding the emperor had long since crumbled. His brother, Louis of Orleans, was plotting against the Duke of Burgundy. His wife, Queen Isabella, was openly corresponding with the Burgundians and, according to rumors, was sleeping with their ambassador. The heir, the Dauphin, was hiding in the Loire. The church was wavering. Some bishops demanded that the king be excommunicated as a madman. Others claimed that his illness was a gift from above, and that to renounce him would be to curse the crown. Inside the palace, other games were being played. Who would sign the dying man's will? Who would replace his doctors? Who would supervise his meals? The meat served to Charles was checked 3 times, but once a piece of lead bullet was found in it. His old page, Pierre de Saint-Maur, was executed the next day. Before his death, he swore that he had only added sleeping grass so that he would not suffer. However, after his execution, Charles screamed one name for 3 nights in a row, Pierre, 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 and tore his hair out. The Spanish ambassador's letters, dated October, state, "I saw him only through a crack in the door. He was naked, covered with ulcers, his face scarred. He did not resemble a human being. He whispered in Latin, although, as they say, He had long since forgotten all languages. I was shaken. I left without saying goodbye. We are not dealing with a king, but with an instrument of punishment. Towards the end, he stopped moving. His body swelled up like a blown-up wineskin. Yellow-black pus oozed from the cracks in his legs. His chest heaved with wheezing. His temperature remained high. The doctor later recorded dry fever, delirium, no sweat. His kidneys were failing. His urine was black with sediment. The skin on his palms was peeling off. Doctors tried to pierce his body in several places to release the foul-smelling fluid, but only intensified the stench. The entire furnishings of the room had to be replaced. The curtains were burned, the bed was burned, even the floor was scraped clean. Woodcutters found rotting rats in the cracks of the floorboards. Once he broke the chains, gnawed through the leather bandage, and broke his servant's finger with his teeth. That was the last straw. He was finally chained up, a chain around his neck, 2 leather straps around his hips, iron on his legs. No one was allowed to approach him without 3 witnesses. He was fed by a mute boy with a wooden spoon from a bowl of thin porridge. The spoon was thrown away after each meal. 2 days before his death, Carl sat without blinking and repeated the same thing over and over. I am not a human being. I am the earth. The earth wants me back. Then he stood up without help for the first time in many months and began to scratch the floor with his fingernails. The maid claimed that sand was dripping from his mouth. Blood appeared on his forehead. Then they laid him down, drove wooden wedges into the doorframe, and locked him in. The next morning, he was still breathing, but his eyes were rolled back. Steam was coming from his mouth, even though the room was cold. They did not touch him. 6 hours later, he stopped breathing. His body did not cool for another 18 hours. One of the priests refused to perform the rites. He died without a soul. It was not a body that was carried out of the chamber where he died, but the remains of a state. At 7 o'clock in the morning on November 6th, the time was recorded by a notary at the Royal Treasury. 5 men in leather masks, smeared with fur oil, pulled Charles's remains out on a shroud without touching them with their hands. One of them later wrote in a private letter, "The skin was green, loose, the eye sockets empty. There was a hole in the stomach from which a liquid resembling rotten milk oozed. The coffin was nailed shut. The doctors refused to perform an autopsy. The royal pharmacist, Pierre Blanchard, fainted after one attempt to touch the body and died of fever the next day. Instead of an autopsy, the body was sprinkled with vinegar, rubbed with salt, its mouth sealed with wax, and wrapped in tar-soaked cloth. An embalmer who had previously worked at the court of Anjou was found in the basements of the Louvre. He arrived at night, accompanied by guards. He was strangled a week later to prevent him from spreading rumors. The next morning, it rained in Paris. The courtyard in front of Saint-Paul was cordoned off. Townspeople were not allowed to come closer than 100 paces. Charles's entire body was wrapped in 3 layers of cloth, with bundles of rosemary and thistles placed inside. A court chronicler wrote, "The smell was so bad that the catafalque had to be covered with tar." 2 days before the funeral, a struggle for seals and signatures began. The Duke of Burgundy seized the chancellery, dismissed the chancellor, and ordered Charles's last letter to be burned. The letters contained orders that, it is claimed, could have declared the Dauphin incapable of ruling. The court notary, Arnaud Leclerc, secretly informed the ambassador of Flanders. The inheritance is being replaced. The jurors are rewriting the will according to the voice of the dead. While Charles' body lay cooling in the hall of the cathedral, the Duke of Burgundy's knights removed all of the Dauphin's supporters from the Louvre. The supporters of Orléans locked themselves in the La Tour-Neuf tower. Several guards were hanged in the courtyard to prevent leaks. Queen Isabella disappeared. She was later found in an abbey under the pretext of praying for the salvation of her husband's soul. Chests with seals, 5 bags of silver, and signet rings were also found there. On the day of the funeral, the hearse stopped halfway to the Basilica of Saint-Denis. One of the wheel locks broke. A servant accompanying the procession claimed that the wheel broke not from the weight, but from anger. The service did not last long. None of the high clergy wished to lead the funeral mass. Silence reigned in the temple. Only the muffled cries of Charles' old servant could be heard under the arches. That same morning, an emergency occurred in Saint-Denis. Charles's body had not been completely embalmed. A liquid seeped from under the burial shroud, and soon the entire hall was filled with rot. One of the priests standing at the head of the coffin began to cough up blood. He was later taken to a monastery, where he died on the fourth day. The consequences were immediate. France was divided. The north swore allegiance to Burgundy. The center rallied around Orléans. The Dauphin was unable to raise an army. His entourage suspected that Charles's body had been used to falsify the will. One of the knights openly accused the Duke of Burgundy of forging the seals. A week later, he was killed, and his body burned in a ditch. Meanwhile, rumors spread among the people. Some said that the king had been cursed by witches. Others said that he had gone mad after the murder of his own brother. There were stories that he was not dead, but had been taken to a dungeon where he was chained and scraping the floor. One shepherd claimed to have heard a voice calling his name at night. The townspeople began to avoid Saint-Paul. Monks began performing mass purification rituals. Dead birds were found in wells. People fled Paris. Bread prices doubled. It was believed that the city was cursed. The royal guard was replaced. Anyone who had touched Charles' body was quietly removed. The final blow came when a letter arrived at the Vatican describing Charles' death. The doctors there stated that the signs pointed to internal decomposition, post-mortem tissue decay, a rare condition, but one that had been recorded in the damned. This was taken as a sign. France was left without a king. The land that Charles called his body really began to fall apart. On the third day after the funeral, black smoke appeared in the Paris sky. The treasury was burning. The fire broke out in the lower hall of the Louvre, where tax lists, debt documents, and seals, including Charles' personal seal, were kept. At first, it was thought to be an accident. Then it was discovered that the guards had been changed 2 hours before the fire, and the chief archivist's diary was missing. One of the witnesses seized during questioning. We were told to get rid of the old stuff so it wouldn't get in the way of the new. Around the same time, the Duke of Burgundy declared himself temporary guardian of the throne and proclaimed himself guardian of the young Dauphin. In Paris, they started hanging flags with a black lily, a sign of mourning and strength. But just a week later, in Reims, under the protection of the Orleanists, another regent was proclaimed, Count Armand de Brienne, an ally of the Queen. In one night, France was divided into 3 camps. Everyone waited to see who would move their troops first. Meanwhile, Charles' body had still not been laid to rest. The coffin had not been lowered into the ground. Due to the unstable situation in Saint-Denis, it was left in a crypt without a tombstone, in a sealed side chapel. One monk, who was allowed inside to pray, later wrote, "The stones were wet, as if pus was oozing from them. I heard something moving in the tomb. I felt sick." The coffin was examined. It was bound with a triple chain and sealed with sealing wax. Rumors spread. People whispered in the city that Charlemagne would return, that his body was not decaying, but breathing. Women in the Latin Quarter boiled water with charcoal and smeared it on their children to protect them from the royal spirit. One priest, caught with a goat's skull, confessed under torture that he had prayed for the return of the Lord from the ground. He was executed. A day later, a dog was found in a well near the cathedral, with a lily burned into its back. The crown chancellor was found hanged in his house, with no signs of a struggle. His jaw had been torn out. Written in blood on the wall were the words, "He is still here." The investigation lasted 2 days, and was terminated by order of the Duke. The chancellor's body was buried at night, without ceremony. troops began to move in the north of the country. The Duke of Burgundy gathered knights in Rennes. The people of Orléans reinforced the garrison in Tours. The letters of foreign ambassadors were filled with fear and indecision. The Spanish ambassador wrote, "The death of Charles has given free rein to the demons. The people are silent, but their hands are clenched around knives." Meanwhile, the dead king continued to live on in people's minds. Old chroniclers began to rewrite his image. From the beloved, he became the rotten. They wrote about his chains, how he ate dirt, how he screamed at night. One of the monks, Brother Thibault, wrote, he knew he was going to hell, and he could already hear his name being called. We are witnesses to the hell that began during his lifetime. The church officially refused to recognize his death as holy. The papal nuncio refused to commemorate him. Only the Dauphin remained of the royal family, but his legitimacy was disputed. The Orleanists claimed that Charles had deprived him of his rights. The Burgundians claimed the opposite, that the Dauphin was the heir by blood. The people claimed that it was not a man who ruled, but a ghost. Skirmishes broke out in the provinces. In Avignon, a judge who recognized Charles' decree as authentic was torn to pieces. In Rouen, a crowd ransacked the residence of the ducal representative, shouting, "Give us the chains." Meanwhile, Charles' body began to influence the climate of the court. Even after his death, the rooms where he had lived were walled up. They were surrounded by a wall. The stones where his bed had stood were cut out and taken away from the city. One of the stonecutters later died of consumption. His wife committed suicide. Their son disappeared without a trace. The courtiers were afraid to speak of him aloud. Only in whispers did they refer to him as he. Even among the monks of Saint-Denis, his name was no longer spoken. A copper cross without an inscription was placed at the burial site. A servant who tried to restore the epitaph disappeared. Records of his birth, wedding, and coronation were removed. The court chronicler received an order: erase the portrait, rewrite the dates, remove the chronicles. History no longer knows him. By the end of the month, rumors were spreading again in Paris. Several soldiers saw a man in white at the castle gates. Candles disappeared from homes. Wheezing could be heard in the basements. The queen no longer appeared in public. Priests performed purification rites every morning. The bodies of the poor who had died in city hospitals were wrapped in shrouds and buried outside the city walls, so as not to defile the land of the dead king. And in Saint-Denis, a candle burned in the window of the crypt at night. By February of the following year, despite triple walls and cement mixed with vinegar, odors began to emanate from the crypt in Saint-Denis. The monks complained of headaches and nausea after Vespers. One of them, Brother Dominic, wrote in his prayer journal, "There is bitterness in the air. The candles go out by themselves. I see a face moving in the shadows, but it is not human." They refused to open the crypt. No one wanted to repeat the incident with the apothecary Bronchard. It was decided to lock the entire basement, hang chains on the doors, and board them up. The Archbishop of Paris blessed the walls with oil and salt. 2 armed monks were posted at the entrance. This was the first time in the history of Saint-Denis that a king's body was guarded after death, not from thieves, but from the living. There was growing division in the capital. The Burgundians declared that Charles was cursed for the sins of his fathers, and that his illness was a punishment. The Orleanists, on the contrary, claimed that Charles had been poisoned. A secret pamphlet appeared, the Confession of the Chained King, attributed to the deceased. It said, "I ate the earth because I wanted to return to it. I screamed because I heard them cutting the angels. They came to me through the blood of my guards." The author could not be identified, but the owners of the pamphlet were executed. In the monastery of Marmoutier, a scribe was arrested for keeping a copy of the medical journal of Charles' last year of life. It described cracks in his skull, loose bones at the base of his face, spasms of the tongue, itchy skin, and nighttime attacks during which the king beat his head against the walls and howled until he lost consciousness. It also contained the words of the physician. He became a corpse while still alive. No blood flowed when he was cut. The flesh on his feet fell off like a crust. This scribe was later declared insane and burned for heresy. In the spring, France split up for good. There were 3 people who wanted to be king. The Dauphin, who was hiding in Tours, said he was the rightful heir and blamed the Duke of Burgundy for killing his dad. The Duke, in turn, convened a council in Dijon and declared that a madman could not be anointed, and therefore, before his death, Charles had ceased to be king, and his will was therefore null and void. This was the reason for the outbreak of war. Border castles began to burn, rumors spread through the villages. The king was a beast, now the beast is out. And in Saint-Denis, new phenomena began. On Easter night, 3 sextons left their posts. One of them later reported that a child was crying in the crypt. They were expelled. But 2 days later, the crypt door was found wide open. The seals had been broken. The chains were on the floor. The lid of the coffin was cracked. The authorities claimed that vandals were responsible, but no one took responsibility. The cameras at the doors did not record anything. The priests refused to enter the crypt. The coffin was nailed shut again, this time with lead. Mass fear began to spread throughout Paris. People did not leave their homes at night. Rumors spread that Charles' body had been replaced, that a pig lay in his place, and that the real one was buried in a secret crypt. Spontaneous memorial services began. People wrote in charcoal on the walls of houses. The chains have not been removed. One of the senior advisors fell from a balcony in the Louvre, shouting before he died, "He's coming! He remembers everyone by name!" In the capital's hospital, doctors began to record dreams that were identical among different patients. They all saw a man with no eyes, with skin stretched over his bones, crawling towards them and whispering, "Where are my bones?" Priests recommended not sleeping on your back and lighting 3 candles. Candle sales tripled. People were even afraid to say Charles' name out loud. In schools, children whispered stories about the Earth Eater. Only one thing became real. The fact of his life turned out to be more terrifying than his death. In May, after a night fire in Saint-Denis, a hole was discovered in the wall of the crypt. Someone or something had dug a tunnel from the inside. Fragments of fingernails, strands of hair, and traces of crawling were found on the floor. One of the guards who saw this went mad. He was taken to a monastery. Until his death, he cried out, "They freed him!" The final blow was the disappearance of the body. When the crypt was officially opened in June, it was empty. No coffin, no chains, not a single trace. The authorities declared it an attack by barbarians. The Duke of Burgundy ordered the entire crypt to be demolished and filled with lead. The people of Orléans accused him of concealing evidence. The monks of Saint-Denis were sent to the provinces. The Pope imposed an interdict on the entire royal family. France never recovered from this. The throne remained empty. 3 pretenders fought, but none could unite the people under his rule. In the provinces, people began to say that the king was alive, that he would judge everyone on earth before God judged them in heaven. Old women sold clay from his footsteps. In shops, chains were cut and worn around the waist as protection. A chronicler who lived 30 years later wrote, "Charles did not die. He returned to the earth, and every step on it is a step on his body." Thus ended the era of Charlemagne, not in a crown, not on a throne, but in the silence of a crypt that no longer exists. His death did not bring peace. His corpse did not rest in peace. His name became empty, but that only made it more terrifying.